mission and core curriculum. They feature a series of guest speakers and conclude with a roundtable analysis of the week's lectures by members of the college faculty. I guess you could call it our version of the Fox All-Stars. Confirmed guest speakers for the Churchill CCA program include some of the speakers you've heard here at this program or will hear, as well as Minnie Churchill, who will discuss Churchill's painting and is co-author of a book on the subject, and also the great actor Robert Hardy, who starred in the 1981 production Winston Churchill, The Wilderness Years. So we hope to see you on campus in October. Our next speaker is James Muller, who's professor of political science at the University of Alaska in Anchorage and academic chairman of the Churchill Center. Dr. Muller served as a White House fellow in the U.S. Department of Education in the Reagan administration. His teaching, research, and writing have, for many years, focused on the statesmanship and writings of Winston Churchill. He has published new editions of two of Churchill's interwar books of essays, Thoughts and Adventures and Great Contemporaries. He is currently at work on a new edition of Churchill's autobiography, My Early Life, as well as a book on Churchill's writings titled The Education of Winston Churchill. He is also preparing a new edition of Churchill's book, The River War, an historical account of the reconquest of the Sudan, which will be republished later this year. This is also the theme of his talk today, titled Lessons from Churchill's The River War. Please welcome to the podium Dr. James Muller.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a delight to be here. Richard mentioned technology, and I'm just waiting for this. President Arnn and fellow Churchillians, I'm delighted to be in Denver for this important conference. I want to thank Larry Arnn, whom I first met more than 40 years ago, and also Hillsdale College, which I first visited more than 40 years ago, for bringing us together to learn from Winston Churchill. And I should say that my interest in Churchill goes back to about that same era, to Winston Churchill's 100th birthday, when I was a graduate student, and those of us who were living together out on the edge of town decided to have a birthday party for Winston Churchill. We listened to Edward R. Murrow's record with Churchill's speeches. We bought some tomato juice and some vodka, and which was all we could afford. And when our guests came, we said, Bloody Mary? And I think I had a Virgin Mary, but after listening to Churchill's speeches, I decided I ought to learn some more about Churchill. And I would add one book to those that have been suggested among the first one might read, which is Thoughts and Adventures. That was the first one I read, and I'm still hooked. But I agree with Richard Langworth that My Early Life is a wonderful place to begin. And I always say when someone asks me, what book should I read about Churchill? I say read books by Churchill first. There are lots of people writing books about him, but his own books are the best. Now I'm going to speak about a time in Churchill's early life, which has been referred to a bit up till now, but it's way back in 1898. When Churchill first went to Africa as a young cavalry officer and as a war correspondent. He took part in Britain's campaign to rescue the Sudan from an Islamist regime. His 15 newspaper dispatches from that campaign, which he wrote in purple ink with a fountain pen after long marches through the Sahara Desert in high summer, when the temperature was more than 110 degrees during the day, on letter paper he had borrowed from the British Embassy in Cairo, were published eventually in the Morning Post in London. After serving in Africa, Churchill left the army and he spent a year writing a book on the campaign. Of the 5 books he wrote before entering Parliament in 1901 at the age of 26, this book is the most impressive. Churchill called it The River War. 3 years after it was published, he abridged it into a single volume for the second edition in 1902. 7 chapters disappeared completely, and passages were cut from every chapter, including his own adventures and his controversial judgments. The full text of this book has been out of print since 1902. 25 years ago, I was on my wedding trip. I was sitting in the British Library, and I made the discovery that the expensive new edition of all of Churchill's writings that I had bought had only an abridged version of this book, The River War. If I had known Richard Langworth better, he would have told me that already, but it was a few months to go before I actually met him in person. And I looked up this edition, this unabridged 2-volume edition of The River War in the North Reading Room of the British Library and discovered that it had many, many wonderful things that I had missed in reading the shorter version of the book. This new edition of The River War that I decided somebody ought to prepare, and I ended up being the one 25 years ago, is now finally nearing completion and is going to be published in 2 volumes by St. Augustine's Press. On these slides, and also in the new edition, the passages that were left out of the second edition are going to be in red, while the passages that remained in the second edition after the cuts are in black. And that way, you'll have some sense of what you've been missing if you've never read the full 2-volume edition of The River War. Churchill, whose regiment was stationed in India in 1898, got to the Sudan in time to ride in the cavalry charge in the climactic Battle of Omdurman across the river from Khartoum. Now, high civilization in Egypt goes back thousands of years, even before the glory of Greece and Rome. It was all made possible by the river, without which Egypt would be only a desert. The river is the Nile, and the annual miracle of its life-giving flood captivated men even before the time of Cleopatra. I've borrowed Paul Clay's painting as the background for our slides this afternoon. Churchill was struck by the beauty of the sunsets on the Nile. He wrote in The River War, "The wonderful flame pictures baffle memory and are beyond recall." Egypt is a strip of civilization along the Nile, broadening out into the delta just before it flows into the Mediterranean Sea. To remind you of the geography of northeastern Africa, and incidentally, after making this map, I am impressed forever with Martin Gilbert's efforts at map making. This one map I've made took hours and hours, and I don't think it's quite as good as Martin's, but I hope it'll be good enough to give you an idea of the 2 branches of the Nile River, the White Nile and the Blue. The White Nile begins in the Great Lakes of Central Africa, losing much of its water through evaporation as it flows leisurely through the jungle. If you've seen The African Queen, you know what the jungle is like, choked with tangled vegetation called sood on its way north. The Blue Nile, on the other hand, is quite different. It rises in the mountains of Ethiopia. When the snows melt, it comes rushing downstream through a canyon. The 2 branches of the Nile meet at Khartoum, which means the elephant's trunk. 4/5 of the water that flows downstream from Khartoum comes from the Blue Nile, and it carries the silt that makes the Nile Delta so fertile. That flow is seasonal. It accounts for the flood that irrigates the banks of the river hundreds of miles north in Egypt. And then only one other tributary flows into the river, north of Khartoum, the Atbara River, which dries up into disconnected stagnant pools in the summertime. Then the Nile flows through the Sahara Desert for 800 miles without gaining a single drop of water. Here's another map of Egypt and the Sudan, though this one doesn't have the newly formed nation of South Sudan, which separated from the southern third of the Sudan in 2009. The right to divide the water from the Nile, which is critical to Ethiopia, Egypt, and both Sudans, remains a matter of contention and high-level negotiation. In the 19th century, slavery was the most important institution in the economy of the Sudan. After the fall of Napoleon, Egypt, which was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, decided to become an imperial power in imitation of European imperialism. Even the pharaohs had never been able to conquer the Sudan. The Sahara Desert was a daunting obstacle. But in the early 1800s, an Egyptian army managed to go up the Nile, capture Khartoum, and impose a harsh rule on the Sudanese. The Egyptians took over the slave trade. Before long, the Sudanese rose in rebellion against Egyptian misrule. Muhammad Ahmed, the son of a boat builder, became a prophet, and he rallied his countrymen to throw off the invaders' corrupt version of Islam. Proclaiming himself the Mahdi, he aspired to make the whole world, including Cairo, Constantinople, and even London, submit to the true faith. Churchill thinks the Sudanese had good cause to rebel, and his treatment of the Mahdi in the River War is remarkably generous, as this quotation suggests. The first edition of the River War was illustrated by Angus MacNeill, a fellow officer who, like Churchill, had gone to Harrow School and to Sandhurst. His drawings were left out of the second edition of the book and have never been reproduced in any other edition, but they're going to reappear in this new one. The Mahdi's soldiers were called the dervishes. The term dervish means a religious mendicant who's taken vows of poverty and austerity. MacNeill here depicts a dervish spearman wearing his customary garb, a patched cloak or jibba, and carrying primitive weapons. Meanwhile, the Khedive, who ruled Egypt for the Ottoman Sultan, was a spendthrift. He borrowed huge sums from European lenders. These debts and the heavy taxes that were required to pay interest in them provoked a nationalist revolt in Egypt, which was led by an Egyptian army officer named Arabi Pasha. You see, the Europeans, especially the British and the French, were afraid that if the rebels reneged on this debt and they came to power, then all the creditors would lose their money. And so the British and French governments agreed to suppress the revolt. But then the French fleet declined to take part in the campaign and sailed away from Alexandria Harbor. The British bombarded the harbor and put an end to the rebellion, and Britain became responsible for ruling Egypt. Sir Evelyn Baring, later Lord Cromer, was the British advisor to the Khedive, who ruled nominally for the Ottoman Sultan. What this meant is that the Khedive had to follow whatever advice Cromer gave him. Cromer was later a mentor to the young Winston Churchill. Cromer tried to put the Egyptian economy on a sound foundation, and to do that, he knew that Egypt would have to abandon the Sudan, despite the growing power of the Mahdi, because Egypt simply couldn't afford to keep it. Back in London, the Liberal administration of Prime Minister Gladstone urged Egypt to give up the Sudan. But evacuating the Europeans in Khartoum became urgent as the Mahdist army surrounded the capital. Charles Gordon, who had made his name in China and had battled the slave trade while he was governor of the Sudan, was sent back to Khartoum as the British envoy to save the garrisons. But Gladstone sent him reluctantly, and he sent him without any support. At first, Gordon's reputation awed the dervish army. They were afraid that a British army would follow. But when they saw that he was only one man on a camel, they tightened their grip on Khartoum. For his part, Gordon was stubborn, and he tried to hold the capital rather than just evacuating the Europeans. His situation in Khartoum became dire, but Gladstone was loath to lift a finger to help. An Austrian army officer, Rudolf Slayton, commanded an Egyptian army in Darfur. His soldiers became demoralized because the army was commanded by a Christian. So he told them he was converting to Islam. But his Egyptians were still no match for the dervishes, and Slayton was defeated and captured by the Mahdi. Slayton, then a prisoner, wrote to Gordon, who desperately needed assistance from somebody who had the kind of military experience and ability that Slayton had, offering to escape from the Mahdi and to join Gordon in defending Khartoum. But Gordon rejected Slayton's offer with contempt because Slayton had forsaken his God. Churchill, in the River War, criticizes Gordon, who is admired widely in Britain as a Christian hero, for rejecting Slayton's offer. Gladstone was finally forced to send out not one but two relief expeditions to save Gordon, one going through the desert and the other one along the river. But the expeditions arrived too late. Gordon was put to death by the dervishes, and he became a martyr. And his death, Churchill says, left the British discouraged. The Mahdi was triumphant in Khartoum, and he ruled over all of the Sudan. A few months later, though, the Mahdi died, and he was succeeded by Abdullah, who was a soldier rather than a prophet. Abdullah became the caliph or khalifa. Churchill doesn't find him as sympathetic a figure as the Mahdi, but he admits he did have some civilized qualities, and he's impressed with his statecraft. 6 years later, the empire of the dervishes reached its greatest extent, ruling much of present-day Sudan and South Sudan, and slivers of Ethiopia and Eritrea as well. Abdullah wasn't actually able to conquer Egypt, but he did defeat the Egyptians in a war with King John, and he was master of the Sudan. The British disbanded the old Egyptian army that had fared so ill at the hands of the dervishes. Cromer wanted to reconquer the Sudan, but not right away. A new Egyptian army began to grow up under British command, and Herbert Kitchener became Sirdar of the Anglo-Egyptian army. Kitchener's intelligence chief, General Wingate, and an Austrian priest in dervish captivity, Father Ohrwalder, collected information about the Mahdist regime. Not only did this intelligence assist the eventual campaign to reconquer the Sudan, but also with Wingate's help, Ohrwalder published a book about the dervishes that shocked European readers. And Slayton published another book, Fire and Sword in the Sudan, after escaping from the Mahdi's camp, which was translated into English. These books helped turn public opinion in Britain in favor of helping Egypt to reconquer the Sudan. Meanwhile, the Ethiopians dealt a crushing defeat to a modern Italian army at Adowa, damaging the reputation of Europeans in Africa. And also a French expedition traversing the continent from west to east threatened to prevent a British Cape to Cairo railroad by creating instead an unbroken blue line of French colonies across Africa instead. So early in 1896, Britain resolved to help Egypt reconquer the Sudan. The Anglo-Egyptian army, with British officers commanding native Egyptian and Sudanese troops, crossed the border from Egypt into the Sudan. Kitchener began his campaign by reconquering the northernmost province of the Sudan, Dongola, in 1896, and the progress of the army was eagerly followed in Britain. Kitchener had the latest weapons, ironclad gunboats on the Nile with machine guns and cannons. They followed the army south along the river. McNeill's illustrations show the advances in naval engineering between 1885 and 1898. But it was difficult to ascend the Nile, and the boats had to be towed or even disassembled and portaged around cataracts of the river. Here's one of Angus MacNeill's drawings of local tribesmen who were rounded up. One can only imagine what that was like, to help pull the boats up over the cataracts. As you can see in this satellite photo, the Nile has a big bend in it. Kitchener decided to avoid an advance along that difficult stretch of the river by building a railroad across the Sahara Desert. Construction of this railroad is one of the most dramatic stories in Churchill's book. Experts in England told Kitchener he couldn't build a railway across the Sahara Desert in time of war. Kitchener decided he was going to build it anyway, and his gamble paid off. Getting to Khartoum was the hard part. Once Kitchener's army reached the dervish capital, Abdullah's forces were no match for them. When Kitchener needed more engines than England could provide, he bought them from America. And in the first edition of the River War, but not in the second, Churchill admits that American engines, with their interchangeable parts, stood up better than British ones. By spring 1898, the Anglo-Egyptian army had reclaimed the Sudan along the Nile up to the Atbara River, defeating a dervish army there. Colonel Frank Rhodes, he's the brother of Cecil Rhodes, and he was wounded later in the campaign, is the man on the left in this picture with the pith helmet. He was the original editor of the River War. I don't think he spent as much time on it as I have. Churchill, a young cavalry officer serving in India, had been following the campaign attentively and was eager to be part of it. But it was a long way from India, and the climax of the war was fast approaching. Churchill enlisted help from his mother to get to Egypt. Churchill had had his baptism of fire in Cuba with Spanish forces in 1895 on his 21st birthday. This was his first experience at war. I think Mr. Krauthammer got a little out of kilter last night. Then Churchill had commanded troops for the Queen on the Indian frontier in 1897 in the difficult border country of Pakistan near the Afghan border, according to the modern borders. This campaign in India was the subject of his first book, which had just been published. By a stroke of luck, the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, a man who had not always been friendly to Churchill's father, happened to read Churchill's book, and he invited him to Downing Street for a chat. He offered to help Churchill, and our author quickly asked to go to the Sudan. But Kitchener turned down the Prime Minister's request, just as he had earlier turned down the entreaties from Churchill's mother. Only because the Anglo-Egyptian army was being augmented, stiffened by a few regular British troops, was Churchill able to take part in the campaign despite Kitchener's opposition. He barely got to Africa in time for the climax. Because Churchill was late, he had to hurry to catch up with his regiment, the 21st Lancers. As he tells us in the first edition of the River War, but not in the second, he got lost in the desert and he had to find his own way. Fortunately, he didn't run into any dervish scouts while he was alone in the Sahara Desert, he and his little pony. But the River War does teach us plenty about camels. I wore my camel tie today. And for instance, it tells us how long a camel can go without water. 5 days. And then, if the camel drinks as much as possible at a good water hole, maybe 5 days more, but then the camel will die. Well, when Churchill and the army drew near to Khartoum, he could hear the drums, and he could hear the ombia, a horn made from an elephant's trunk that helped keep up the good order and the morale of Abdullah's army. He was also impressed by the dervishes' battle flags, which marked parts of the army, commanded by subordinate khalifas and emirs. They reminded him of the banners he had seen in the Bayeux tapestry. The climax of the campaign was the Battle of Omdurman. The Sirdar's gunboats and machine guns made it an unequal battle for the dervishes. They were mown down by the hundreds. Most of the British casualties, which were far fewer, took place among the 21st Lancers, who were ordered to charge into a watercourse full of dervishes. In the hand-to-hand fighting, the odds were much more even. Churchill, who fought with a brand new Mauser pistol instead of a sword because he'd injured his shoulder in India, suffered no harm to himself or to his horse. Even before the Anglo-Egyptian army entered the dervish capital of Omdurman, across the river from Khartoum, Kitchener's gunboats had done serious damage to the tomb of the Mahdi. Targeting the tomb, which of course was the most notable and revered building in the capital, was controversial, and Churchill was one of the critics. In the first edition of the River War, Churchill writes a lengthy critique of Kitchener's bombardment of the tomb. Like many of the criticisms he wrote, it's softened in the abridged second edition. Churchill, who had noticed how the British treated native religions in India with forbearance and respect, thought it was a mistake to depart from that prudent policy in the Sudan. Kitchener had the Mahdi's skull made into an inkwell, which he was happy to use until Queen Victoria and Lord Cromer insisted on having it properly reburied in Wadi Halfa. Churchill argues that if the British are going to treat the Sudanese with savagery, then they're no better than the dervishes. Eventually, after the Second World War, the British allowed the Sudanese to rebuild the tomb of the Mahdi, which became a place of pilgrimage. Notice the little emblem on the cupola of the tomb on the right-hand side, because it will figure in the story a little later. Because of his criticisms of Kitchener, for this and many other reasons, including the treatment of the wounded on both sides, the British and the Sudanese, Churchill damns Kitchener by faint praise in the first edition of the River War. You can see this. He says he occupies certainly the third and possibly even the second place. I think he thought Cromer certainly had the first place, and perhaps Churchill meant that maybe Lord Salisbury, who had allowed it all and to whom he dedicated the first edition of the River War, had the second place, leaving Kitchener a poor third. But in the second edition, as you can read, he softens that judgment. Two days after the battle, a memorial service was held for Charles Gordon in the ruins of his palace in Khartoum, where Gordon's favorite hymn, "Abide With Me," was sung. And at that service, for the first time during the campaign, the British raised a Union flag larger than the Egyptian one. But Churchill slept through it. I thought you might enjoy seeing the title pages and the new frontispieces of the 2 volumes of the new edition of The River War. I'm grateful to Lady Soames, who wrote the foreword to the new edition, to Richard Langworth, who encouraged this project from the very beginning, to Larry Arnn, who, before he was president of Hillsdale, arranged for both editions of the book to be scanned and offered funding from the Equus Institute, to Bruce Fingerhut, my publisher at St. Augustine Press, to Alan Packwood and his staff at the Churchill Archives Center for all their help in research, to my collaborators Paul Courtney and Erica Chenoweth, and to the Churchill Center for steady support and assistance. 3 days after the battle, Churchill rode over the battlefield with a Scottish officer, Lord Tullibardine, the son of the Duke of Atholl. In one of the most unforgettable chapters in the book, which is entirely omitted from the second edition, Churchill describes the suffering of the wounded dervishes who were neglected and still dying on the battlefield 3 days after the battle in that heat. His colleague was able to extract the bullet from the knee of one of them as they went on, and Churchill and Lord Tullibardine tried to give water to the sufferers on the battlefield until their canteens ran dry. Later, Tullibardine enlisted help from his friends, not including Churchill as far as I can see, in carrying spoils of the campaign back to his castle in the Scottish Highlands, where they decorate the banqueting hall. He also removed a copper emblem from the top of that cupola of the Mahdi's tomb and installed it on the clock tower of his castle. His letter to the family shows where the emblem was taken down from the top of the tomb. Unfortunately, later, his clock tower burned down and the emblem melted in the fire. So what you see in the photo is a reconstruction of the tower and a replica of the emblem that used to be at the top of the tomb in Omdurman. Churchill left the Sudan soon after the battle, taking Nile steamers and the desert railway north. At a station in the desert, the train broke down. When the Arab engine driver attributed the delay to Allah, discerning some wise purpose in the delay, a lieutenant, or as the British say, a lieutenant, of the Grenadier Guards, who had experience driving trains, Frederick Harvey Bathurst, rolled up his sleeves and got the engine moving again. Some of the officers thought that conduct was unbecoming to a British gentleman, but Churchill admires his ability. This episode provoked a Churchillian effusion in a chapter of the first edition that is omitted in the second edition. This quotation has flown around the internet nonstop ever since 9/11. People have looked it up in the River War. They can't find it. That's because they only have the abridged version of the book. Of course, this passage would now be considered politically incorrect. And Churchill may have left it out of the second edition because he thought it impolitic. After all, the British Empire had many Muslim subjects. Last year, a British politician of sorts was even arrested for quoting this passage in public. Britain doesn't have a First Amendment. But look, if you read the quotation, it's hard to object to Churchill's criticism of people who treat women as property. The passage, which people looked for in vain in the abridged edition, will be restored, of course, in the new one. The train did get moving again, and Churchill returned to Cairo with a fellow officer who had been wounded. In my early life, you can read the story of how Churchill had to have a little bit of skin from his arm sawed off to help provide a skin graft to Richard Molyneux. I wanted you to read this because here's another passage, this time from an early chapter of the River War, which did survive the editing, with Churchill's curious spelling of development, which was changed in the second edition, and a drawing by Angus MacNeil in the first edition that some people may think no less objectionable. In fact, some people have argued that this passage and others like it show that Churchill was a racist. The truth is more complicated and more to Churchill's credit. He begins the River War by reflecting the usual Victorian prejudice against black people. But then, as the book goes on, he deliberately undermines it. By the end of the book, having rejected the usual prejudice, Churchill argues that the 10th Sudanese, which is a black regiment in the Anglo-Egyptian army, ranks with the best troops of the empire, British or native. I've highlighted that passage, but let me show it to you bigger, and I hope some of you can read it. You'll see that in this, Churchill even argues that the charge these black troops made in the 10th Sudanese in a subsequent battle of the war after Churchill and most of the British troops had returned to the UK was finer than the charge of the 21st Lancers at Omdurman. Against the usual view among British officers that black soldiers wouldn't make good cavalry troopers, Churchill includes a footnote approving of the formation of black squadrons of cavalry. His aim is to weaken prejudice by offering examples that disprove it and encouraging opportunities that have been denied to black troops on account of prejudices up till now. To return to the dervish soldiers, Churchill denies that they were mad fanatics for pitting their trashy weapons against the machine guns and the gunboats of a far more advanced enemy. You see what he says. He claims that these were as brave men as ever walked the earth. And he claims that they fought to the death because they were noble and honorable. His magnanimity to a defeated enemy was controversial when he published it, but it remained his lifelong view. Here is Churchill, much older, inspecting bomb damage in London during the Blitz. And here on the left in red is Churchill with Churchillian bravery and oratory in his 20s in the pages of the River War, anticipating Britain's finest hour more than 4 decades before he became Prime Minister. Churchill spent a year after the campaign writing the River War, using his dispatches from the Morning Post as raw material, but also studying the history of the Sudan. He considered how Britain had changed its future by the reconquest, and he asked whether that change would help or hurt the people of the Sudan. He's lukewarm about imperialism, grand projects of development, higher education, Christian missionary work, and grasping entrepreneurs in the Sudan. And he thinks what the country needs is very small development projects, like digging wells, and that the country is going to need a long time to recover from the war. Churchill's adventures in the South African War, where he was captured and imprisoned by the Boers, but managed to escape and return to friendly territory, made him famous. Before long, he was elected to the House of Commons, where he took his seat as a member of parliament for Oldham early in 1901. But look at this, more than half a century later, nearing the end of his political career, in his second prime ministry in October 1952, Churchill welcomed the posthumous son of the Mahdi, who left one of his new wives pregnant when he died. And this man came to number 10 Downing Street in anticipation of Sudanese independence, which was granted on January 1st, 1956. Since then, the Sudan has had a succession of regimes, one of which in the 80s included other descendants of the Mahdi. I'm afraid most of those regimes have been thuggish, terrible regimes, including the one that's in power right now. Thank you for your kind attention, and I think the floor is now open for questions. You know, I think this book is a wonderful opportunity for somebody who wants to understand one of the challenges that Charles Krauthammer was talking about that America faces now. And I know it's required reading in some of our nation's military colleges. I'm going to the U.S. Naval War College next week to speak about it.
What was the most surprising thing you learned after doing this new edition? What was the one thing that stood out?
Well, there are many interesting things I learned. I learned a lot about how Churchill writes. I learned, for instance, that mostly he writes on the basis of what he remembers. And though he did look up some of these quotations and references, mostly he simply remembered them. And his memory was amazing, as had been his father's. His father had almost a photographic memory, but it wasn't perfect. And so occasionally he gets a quotation a little bit wrong. Very often he doesn't tell you where the quotation comes from. And it's been my ambition to try to track down the source of every quotation in the book and to give identifications in footnotes of everyone Churchill mentions in the book, which has occasioned a great deal of detective work and has been quite a lot of fun. What I've discovered there is that Churchill doesn't ever want to quote a passage that isn't written up to his own standard. And so often he will improve the English of the writing when he quotes something. So that was one interesting thing I learned. I mean, there were many others. I think learning about the circumstances of this quotation on Islam, which Churchill wrote when he was sort of frustrated by being stuck in the desert, was an interesting thing to discover. And of course, tracking down the dispatches that Churchill wrote, which were the original version of some of the parts of the book, was interesting too. Those were not available or known in their manuscript version when the official biography was written. And they appeared finally in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, in the archive at the University of Leeds. Of course, the dispatches had been published in the newspapers, and they'd been published again several times in book form. But the book version was based only on the newspaper version, and the newspaper editor changed what Churchill wrote in many, many ways and left out things. And so in the new edition, there's quite a long appendix in the second volume that has, for the first time, the full version of the dispatches as Churchill wrote them, published and compared to the newspaper version. And I think those of you who know all about the River War and have read the two-volume version will find that appendix very interesting, unless you've been to Leeds and read the original handwritten dispatches there. 14 of them survive, one of them doesn't. So But that was certainly a wonderful discovery. I discovered it when I was in London. I got on a train to Leeds, not knowing how far it was to Leeds, and had to come back that night to get my suitcases to spend another couple of days transcribing those 15 dispatches. And then I had a student who learned to read Churchill's handwriting very well by hard knocks, who helped me proofread it and make sure we got every comma and misspelled word right. Churchill's spelling wasn't too great when he wrote these dispatches.
Churchill has mentioned, along with Lincoln and Washington. In books on Lincoln, I have noticed metaphors, biblical metaphors in his writings and comments on Christianity. We've heard comments on Islam by Churchill. What did he have to say about Christianity or his understanding?
Churchill tells us in the River War, which was written much later in the 1930s, that in his youth he went through a violent anti-religious phase, which, if it had continued, would have made him obnoxious. In the River War, you can see signs of that. He mentions that Christianity, if it had not been sheltered in the strong arms of science, against which it struggled in vain, might have been no match for the military forces of Islam. And he has some other things to say, too. I mentioned his reservations about Gordon's confidence that because he was a Christian hero, his martyrdom would somehow be repaid in heaven. Churchill seems to think this was a most imprudent way of trying to save the lives of the Europeans in Khartoum, most of whom perished when the city was taken over by the dervishes. Later, of course, Churchill softened his statements on Christianity, and that's a long, interesting, and complicated subject about which our next speaker has spoken with after careful research. I don't know if he'll talk about it today, but I recommend his talk if you get hold of it on that subject. Though I probably have a few disagreements with bits of it. Thanks.
Sir?
Yes?
I wonder if Winston Churchill ever forecast or speculated on general warfare between Islamic armies and the armies of the Christian or Judeo-Christian West.
Well, I think he was lucky enough to live in a time when the aspirations, let's say, of the Mahdi to take over the whole world and submit it to Islam were obviously unrealistic. I mean, I think Queen Victoria, when she got his letter asking her to renounce Christianity and become a Muslim, probably had a good laugh about it. But Churchill, certainly later in his career, and not much later, was very interested in the reforms that were attempted by those who called themselves the Young Turks in Turkey to try to establish a Turkish state on a secular basis, a state that would have a majority Muslim population, an overwhelmingly majority Muslim population, but with strong Christian and populations of other religions, Zoroastrians, and various branches of Islam and Christian believers. And he was discouraged, of course, when the Turks chose the wrong side in the First World War, perhaps somewhat pleased by the eventual launching of the Turkish Republic under Ataturk, and I think would be watching closely the changes that are going forward in Turkey right now.
This will be our final question.
With your exhaustive research, I've just got one quick question for you. given that Winston Churchill, his early career, he had to have interactions, understandings of Cecil Rhodes. What could you tell us about that interaction? What was Churchill's opinion of Rhodes with the control over Cape Colony, aka South Africa?
Yeah, I went to South Africa in 1993, just at the time when the changes in the country were about to occur. What had been the house in Cape Town of the President of South Africa, de Klerk, which was the house Cecil Rhodes built for himself in Cape Town, with its 14-foot-long granite bathtub on the second floor. One can only imagine how many men had to haul that up the stairs to install it. That house was about to become Nelson Mandela's house. And I was interested in Churchill's contact with Cecil Rhodes, who was, of course, very important, not just for Rhodes scholarships in America, but even more for the British Empire. Churchill didn't know Cecil Rhodes much. He knew his brother because of his contact with him in this campaign very much better. But when he went to South Africa, he had a number of meals at Rhodes's house. Cecil Rhodes wasn't there then, though. So Churchill did have a great deal to do with the settlement between Boers and Britons, who had launched 2 colonies each on the southern tip of Africa in previous centuries after the South African War, which he participated in. And one of his regrets was that one of the differences between the Boers and the Britons was their treatment of the indigenous population. And the compromise that was made with the Boers in order to form the Union of South Africa in 1906 was to some degree at the expense, of course, of the black citizens of the country. And that wasn't really remedied until much, much later, until the 1990s. And unfortunately, the results of that in terms of making a regime that guarantees the rights and liberties of the people of that country are very mixed. More successful probably than in the Sudan, but still not very encouraging. This idea that people should be ruled by a tyrant of their own race, color, and creed, and that that's adequate to secure happiness and to protect liberty is just plain silly. And we've got to get over that before the countries of Africa, which deserve the opportunity for self-government and for freedom, including freedom of commerce, have a chance to develop and improve themselves in the way they can. And I think one of the most notable and obvious things about Churchill's book is that though he's not rosy-eyed or simple-minded about the obstacles that Africans, and specifically people in the Sudan, will face in bringing their country into the modern world, he thinks it's possible, and he thinks it's possible for them to do it. He thinks they would have done it even if the British had not intervened. It would have taken longer, he admits, and he's of 2 minds about whether it would have worked out better. But at any rate, he thinks Britain has a very serious obligation now, in 1898, after the reconquest, to do its best for the people of the Sudan. And he talks about that in the last chapter of the book, which is left out of the second edition. So, thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, I just have to.
Thank you very much, James Muller. Before I introduce our last speaker of the day, I should mention that flower centerpieces from the lunch will be distributed at the registration desk following the conclusion of today's program. First come, first served, as always. Also, I should take a moment to thank the many members of the Hillsdale College staff, too numerous to name, especially in the offices of special events, external affairs, and institutional advancement, who helped to make this event possible. Thank you very much. Our final speaker of the day is becoming a Hillsdale regular. He has spoken numerous times at Hillsdale events, not only on land, but also at sea during a Hillsdale